They say you never forget the worst day of your life. They're right. Some memories burn so deep you can feel them echo years later, as if your bones still remember the weight of that humiliation. For me, it all began on a cold, gray morning, the kind where the air feels heavy and even the sun refuses to show its face. I was 23, sitting on the edge of my creaking bed in a cramped room that smelled of cheap detergent and old regrets. My hands shook, my breath caught in my chest, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat, and the sirens growing louder outside. My name is Daniel. And on that morning I realized just how fast life can collapse. I had made mistakes. Stupid ones. Out of desperation, greed, or maybe just the naive belief that shortcuts would save me from the life I'd been handed. I got mixed up with people I barely knew, people who promised fast money with no questions asked. But the questions came eventually, and so did the police. They banged on the door so hard the whole frame rattled. I remember standing there, staring at the peeling paint, wishing, just for a second, that I could melt into the walls, disappear, become invisible. But reality doesn't grant those wishes. The door burst open, and before I could even react, 2 officers rushed in, their voices echoing in my tiny room. "Hands behind your back," they shouted. The cold sting of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, and a shame deeper than anything I'd ever felt settled over me like a suffocating blanket. As they dragged me outside, the morning air cut through me, sharp and unkind. And that's when I saw them. My family. They were standing at the end of the driveway, clustered together as if united by disgust. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Not worry, not love, just horror. My father's jaw tightened, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. But it was Matthew, my older brother, who delivered the deepest wound. He laughed. An open, mocking laugh, the kind that makes you feel smaller than dirt. It echoed louder than the sirens, louder than my own pulse, louder than the officer's commands. In that single moment, surrounded by flashing lights and neighbors peering out of windows, my life split in two, before the arrest and after. Before, I was just the family disappointment, the one who never quite measured up. After, I became something worse, a stain on the family name. The silence from them in the following days was louder than any words they could have said. No calls, no visits. Nothing. That first night in a holding cell, I lay on a metal bench, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, trying to remember how it had all gone so wrong. Every path led back to that same desperate desire to prove myself, to show them I wasn't worthless. But now, with chains on my wrists and a criminal record waiting to be stamped, all I'd proven was exactly what they had always believed, that I was the failure of the family. I replayed the look on Matthew's face over and over in my mind. The way his laughter curled at the edges, the smug tilt of his head, as if my downfall had been something he'd been waiting years to celebrate. And in that endless night, something inside me began to shift. The pain, the humiliation, the crushing sense of betrayal, they started to twist into something darker. A promise whispered in the darkest corners of my mind. This isn't how your story ends. I didn't know it then, but that promise would become the single force that kept me alive. Not hope. Not forgiveness. But resolve. One day I thought they won't be the ones laughing. One day the same family who turned their backs on me would see me in a place they could never imagine. And that thought, cold, sharp, and stubborn, was what carried me through the first days of what would become the longest journey of my life. The cell door slammed shut behind me with a clang that reverberated through my chest like a final verdict. Even though I knew this was coming, hearing that iron door close felt like someone sealing my fate with no intention of ever unlocking it again. The first night was the longest night of my life. Time in that place stretched and twisted, turning minutes into hours and hours into eternities. The cold concrete walls felt alive, pressing closer each time I closed my eyes. And all I could think about was them, my family, and how easily they had turned their backs. I was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Just 2 years, they said. But time is relative inside those walls. Some days felt endless. Others disappeared in a haze of routine and despair. And in the silence, the only companion I had was memory. Every memory seemed sharper in the dark. My mother's horrified eyes, my father's cold silence, and Matthew's laughter that wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. Even when I tried to bury it, it found its way back, a relentless whisper reminding me of the shame I'd brought on myself, and on them. First, that shame consumed me. I would lie awake at night, replaying every decision that led to my arrest, cursing my own stupidity. I wondered if things might have been different if I'd had even a single word of encouragement from them. But no letter came. No visitor showed up. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, but my name was never called during visitation hours. My family acted as if I had died, and perhaps, in a way, I had. The person I had been before the arrest was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and far less trusting. Yet strangely, the longer I stayed locked up, the less the pain of their rejection felt like a wound and the more it began to feel like armor. Each day, the thought that they had abandoned me stopped being a source of pain and became a reason to keep going. If they wouldn't stand by me, then I would build a life so big, so undeniable, that they would have no choice but to see me. Not as the family failure, but as something else entirely. In prison, you have a lot of time to think, but you also have time to observe. I watched the way power moved inside those walls. Who had it, who lost it, and why? I saw men who came in broken leave even more broken, and I promised myself that wouldn't be me. I started working out, pushing my body until my muscles ached, as if strength could protect me from despair. And at night, when the others slept, I read every book I could get my hands on. Business, psychology, history, anything that could teach me how the world really worked. Some of the guards mocked me. Other inmates called me professor, half in jest and half with a grudging respect. But I didn't care. My mind was the only place they couldn't lock away, and I planned to make it sharper than any weapon. For the first time in my life, I started to realize that knowledge could be power, maybe even more power than money or muscle. One day, an older inmate named Greg, who had been in and out of prison his whole life, pulled me aside. "You read too much," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "That's good. But don't forget why you're doing it. Knowledge without purpose is just noise." Those words stayed with me. Each night after the lights went out, I asked myself the same question. What's my purpose? And every night the answer grew clearer. To prove them wrong. To become something they could never laugh at again. To build a life so big it would overshadow my worst mistakes. By the time my release date approached, I was no longer the same boy who had been dragged from his room in handcuffs. I had scars, both seen and unseen, but beneath them lay something new. A plan. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I would walk out with nothing. No money, no job, no support. But I also knew I would have something my family never expected. The determination to rewrite the story they thought had ended in disgrace. The day I finally stepped outside, feeling the sun on my face again, I closed my eyes and made a silent vow. They saw me fall, but they will live to see me rise. Freedom tasted strange. The first breath of air outside those gates felt lighter than anything I'd felt in years, yet heavy too, because it came with the weight of knowing that, beyond those prison walls, there was no one waiting for me. No welcome home. No forgiving embrace. Just the cold wind on my face and the echo of my own footsteps as I walked away from the only life I'd known for 2 years. I stepped into a world that had moved on without me. The city felt faster, noisier, and somehow colder than I remembered. Faces blurred past me on crowded sidewalks, eyes fixed on screens, no one seeing me. Yet, in a strange way, that anonymity felt like a gift. I was no longer Daniel, the convict, to them. I was no one. And being no one meant I could become anyone. But starting over wasn't romantic. My first nights were spent on an old friend's couch, the fabric torn and stained by too many late nights and spilled drinks. I had nothing to my name but the clothes I'd worn out of prison, a small duffel bag, and a restless fire inside me that refused to die. Every day I chased work. Any work. Construction sites, warehouse shifts, dishwashing in the back of a greasy diner. Anything that would let me save a few dollars and keep me off the streets. Some days, it felt like my past was stamped on my forehead. Employers would glance at my record and their eyes would harden. "Sorry, kid," they'd say, and the door would close, sometimes literally in my face. But rejection became fuel. Every no added another brick to the wall of determination I was building inside. At night, when exhaustion weighed on my bones, I would sit hunched over a cheap laptop I'd bought secondhand. Under the dim glow of a single lamp, I taught myself everything I could. Marketing strategies, SEO, copywriting, the basics of design, and the psychology of selling. It was like building a new muscle in my mind. Slow, painful, but undeniably real. I remember one night in particular. Rain tapped at the window in a steady rhythm, and the apartment smelled of mildew and cheap takeout. My eyes burned from hours staring at the screen, but I forced myself to finish an online course I'd found for free. As the video ended, the words of the instructor echoed in my mind. The difference between those who succeed and those who fail isn't luck. It's who keeps going when it feels pointless. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and whispered to myself, "Keep going, Daniel." Slowly, the pieces began to form a plan. I noticed a pattern in local businesses. Small restaurants and shops struggling to keep up with the digital age. Their websites were outdated, their social media presence nearly non-existent, and their marketing, if it existed, was scattershot at best. What if I thought I could help them? What if I could build something useful, something that would make them money, and me too? I started knocking on doors. Literally. I'd walk into a diner or a barber shop, introduce myself, and pitch my idea. Modern digital marketing for a price they could afford. Most owners barely listened. Some laughed me off. But a few were different. They saw hunger in my eyes, maybe even desperation, and desperation can be persuasive. My first client was a tiny family-run cafe that smelled of fresh bread and old furniture. The owner, an older woman named Rosa, listened patiently as I stumbled through my pitch. At the end, she said, "You seem like someone who needs a chance." She paid me a fraction of what an agency would charge, but to me it felt like winning the lottery. For weeks, I worked tirelessly for Rosa's cafe. I redesigned their website, set up social media pages, took photos of their menu items, and ran local ads online. It wasn't glamorous work and it wasn't perfect, but it worked. Slowly, foot traffic picked up. Rosa would call me in the evenings, her voice shaking with gratitude, telling me about new customers who mentioned finding them online. And in that small success, I tasted something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real tangible hope. Not the blind, desperate hope that things might magically get better, but the kind you earn brick by brick with blistered hands and sleepless nights. It was a start. And for the first time since I'd walked out of prison, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward something bigger than even I could imagine. It's strange how real change often feels less like a lightning bolt and more like a slow sunrise. At first, you barely notice it, just a faint glow on the horizon. But little by little, the darkness lifts and suddenly you're standing in the light, almost unable to believe it was ever night at all. For me, that light started with Rosa's cafe. After the small success with her business, word spread, slowly at first, like cautious whispers between neighbors. One afternoon, while I was hunched over my laptop in the cafe's corner table, a man approached me. His name was Eric and he ran a struggling local bookstore. His voice carried both pride and desperation. Pride in the shelves he'd spent years curating, and desperation because he could barely keep the lights on. "Rosa says you worked magic," he said, almost embarrassed by the hope in his eyes. "Think you could do the same for me?" I took the job even though he could barely pay me. I worked late into the night, building an online shop for his store, photographing books, writing posts that captured Eric's love for forgotten novels and rare editions. Slowly, customers who had stopped visiting came back. Orders started trickling in online. And with every message from Eric, words like, "I can't believe it's working," or, "You don't know what this means to me," my belief in myself grew stronger. One job led to another. A florist, a barber shop, a tiny vintage clothing store tucked into a side street. I wasn't making much money, but each project built my reputation. And more importantly, each success chipped away at the voice in my head that had spent years whispering, "You're nothing but a failure." Months blurred together in a haze of work. Days started early and ended when my eyelids refused to stay open. My social life disappeared entirely, not that I had much of one left. Friends had drifted away after my arrest, some quietly, others with blunt honesty. But loneliness felt like a small price to pay for purpose. I moved out of my friend's apartment into a cramped studio, barely large enough for a bed and a folding table that doubled as my desk. The walls were bare except for a single piece of paper taped above my workspace. "They laughed when you fell. Make sure they never laugh again." It wasn't poetic, but it was real. And real was all I needed. One night, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back wasn't the same boy who had once been dragged from his home in handcuffs. His face was sharper, lined with determination. His eyes held something new. Not arrogance but quiet certainty. For the first time I didn't look away. My big break came when I met Jasmine, the owner of a small restaurant on the verge of closing. Unlike other clients, she wasn't skeptical, she was desperate. "I have 2 months before I lose everything," she admitted, her voice breaking. Can you help me? I poured every lesson, every late-night reading, every bit of stubborn hope into her project. We revamped her website, filmed short videos of her cooking, ran local ads targeting food lovers in the city. For weeks, I barely slept, driven by the weight of knowing what was at stake, not just for her but for me too. And it worked. Better than either of us had dared to hope. Customers flooded in, drawn by the new energy and authenticity we showed online. Reviews turned positive, tables filled, and Jasmine called me one night crying, not out of fear but relief. You saved us, she whispered. And for a moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride that didn't come from proving someone wrong, but from doing something right. The success of Jasmine's restaurant became a turning point. Local papers mentioned my work. Word spread beyond my neighborhood. Bigger businesses reached out. Not huge corporations but companies large enough to offer real money, steady contracts. I hired 2 freelancers to help handle the growing workload. A graphic designer and a social media manager. For the first time it wasn't just me alone against the world. I named my small agency Phoenix Digital. Because like the mythical bird, I knew what it meant to burn down and rise from ashes. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't built on secrets or shortcuts. It was built on late nights, stubborn grit, and a single unspoken promise. That I would never again be at the mercy of anyone's laughter. As I signed my first real lease for a tiny office downtown, I thought back to that moment outside my childhood home. The flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, the look on my family's faces. I whispered to myself almost as a prayer, "You're not there anymore." And for the first time I almost believed it. Success has a strange smell to it. Like fresh paint, coffee that never gets cold because you're too busy to drink it, and printer ink that stains your fingertips no matter how careful you are. My new office wasn't glamorous. The walls were bare brick, the floor scratched from years of neglect, and the windows rattled in the wind. But to me it was a cathedral built by my own hands. I remember the first morning I unlocked that door. My reflection in the glass showed someone different from the kid who'd walked out of prison with nothing but stubbornness. My shoulders were straighter. My eyes no longer darted around, afraid of judgment. Instead they looked forward, to plans, strategies, clients waiting to be convinced. Phoenix Digital wasn't just an agency. It was proof that I wasn't the sum of my mistakes. Slowly, my name began to mean something beyond the whispered rumors of my past. But even as I built something real, the shadow of my family loomed over me. They hadn't reached out. I hadn't either. It was as if we'd all silently agreed to erase each other. Until the day Matthew walked through my door. I'll never forget the moment. It was late afternoon, the sun throwing long shadows across the floor. I was finishing a call with a potential client when the door opened. At first, I barely looked up. Just another walk-in, maybe someone selling office supplies. But then I saw him. Same confident posture, though it seemed forced now. Same eyes, though a little duller around the edges. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. It felt as if time folded back on itself, dragging us both to that moment outside our parents' house. The laughter still echoing between us. But now the roles were reversed. Here I was the one behind the desk. And Matthew, he looked tired. Deflated. "Daniel," he started, his voice cracking slightly before he found control. "Didn't know this was yours." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "It is. What brings you here?" He shifted from foot to foot, avoiding my eyes. "I heard you're hiring." The words sounded like they tasted bitter on his tongue. I thought back to all the nights alone, all the closed doors, the cheap meals, the constant doubt, and, above all, the sound of his laughter. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to remind him what he'd done. But another part, colder and sharper, whispered, "You don't need to. Just watch him ask. What happened to your last job?" I asked. "Company downsized. Then, another company folded. It's been rough," he admitted. His voice had lost the easy arrogance it once held. And in that moment I realized something. Life had already done what I could never have done with anger alone. It had humbled him. "I can offer you an entry-level position," I said carefully. "No management, no special title. You'd answer to someone younger than you. And the pay, well, it's a start." His eyes tightened, pride and desperation wrestling inside him. But desperation won. "I'll take it," he whispered. As I signed his paperwork, my hand felt steady. Years ago he had laughed as I was led away in chains. Now, without saying a word, life had made him walk into my world, hand outstretched. Over the next few months, others followed. My cousin Emma, after losing her job in finance. My father, forced into early retirement and restless at home. Even my mother, who offered to help with social media, as if that could erase years of silence. I hired them all, not out of kindness but because I had built something that required hands. And theirs for the first time were willing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had been too ashamed to visit me in prison now worked under the name I had built from that very shame. And each morning as I watched them clock in, I remembered the promise I had made. They won't laugh again. But as weeks turned to months, something unexpected happened. The power I felt at first, cold, righteous, began to dull. Watching them humble themselves before me didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it left an emptiness, as if revenge had burned so hot it had scorched everything else around it. Some nights, I caught my reflection in the darkened office windows. And I asked myself a question I'd never dared to ask before. If I'm not the man who failed, and I'm not the man who only lives to prove them wrong, then who am I now? The office grew quieter in the late hours after everyone else had gone home. The hum of the city outside softened, and the silence inside those four walls felt almost sacred. Some nights I stayed behind, staring out through the window as lights flickered across downtown, and I'd ask myself if the boy I'd been, the boy in the handcuffs, would recognize the man I'd become. At first, it felt like victory each time I saw my family clocking in. Matthew coming in early, avoiding my gaze. My father sitting quietly in meetings, his voice softer than I'd ever heard at home. Even my mother, who used to carry herself like a queen, now carefully choosing her words, afraid of stepping on the authority I had built. It should have felt like justice, and for a while it did. But power, I discovered, doesn't shout. It whispers. And its whispers grew louder in the quiet moments, when I wasn't proving anything to anyone. The question haunted me. Was this really who I wanted to be? A man who measured his worth by watching his family shrink in front of him? The hardest conversation came with Matthew. It happened late one evening, long after everyone else had left. I found him in the break room, sitting with his head in his hands, the glow of the vending machine painting his face in cold light. I'd never seen him look so small. Rough day? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up, startled. Yeah, he sighed, and for the first time his voice carried none of that old bravado. I know I'm not good at this, but I'm trying. I studied him silently. In that moment, I didn't see the brother who had laughed when I was arrested. I saw a man weighed down by his own failures, his pride cracked and patched over too many times. Why'd you come here, Matthew? I asked. He hesitated, then spoke with a raw honesty I'd never heard from him. Because I had nowhere else to go. And because I knew you'd give me a chance. Even after everything. His words landed heavy. I wanted to say that I hired him to watch him fall, that I'd done it for revenge. But in that moment I realized it wasn't the whole truth. Part of me had hoped, deep down, that by bringing them into my world maybe they'd see me differently. Maybe finally they'd see me. I sat across from him, the old plastic chair creaking under my weight. Do you know what it was like for me? Asked my voice low. To see you laugh? To watch everyone else turn away. He lowered his gaze. I was young. And stupid. And scared. It doesn't excuse it, but it's true. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt like a bridge we didn't know how to cross. Then quietly Matthew whispered, I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly. The words didn't erase the past, but they cracked something open inside me. I realized then that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to stop letting it define you. And maybe, just maybe, that choice could free me too. After that night I made small changes. Not because they deserved them, but because I needed them. I raised Matthew's position slowly, gave him responsibilities suited to his strengths, and watched as he began to regain a quiet confidence. Not the arrogance of before, but something steadier. My father too changed. One afternoon we shared coffee in my office and he admitted, his voice softer than I'd ever heard, I didn't know how to help you back then. So I didn't. And I've regretted it every day. My mother, still proud but more fragile now, started telling new employees stories about how Daniel built this place from nothing. The words were clumsy, but in them I heard a kind of apology. The truth was, I didn't trust them completely. Some wounds run too deep to ever truly heal. But for the first time, my family wasn't just the people who had watched me fall. They were part of what I had built, what I had risen to become. And late at night, staring out over the city lights, I realized that revenge had gotten me this far, but it couldn't take me further. The real power wasn't in making them bow. It was in knowing I could stand on my own with or without their approval. I thought back to that boy in the handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. If I could speak to him now, I'd tell him this. They might have laughed then, but you will rise. And when you do, you'll discover something far stronger than vengeance. The freedom to define yourself. And in that quiet, I finally understood. I hadn't just rebuilt a life. I'd rebuilt myself. The days began to blend into one another. A rhythm of meetings, strategy sessions, and late nights spent reviewing campaigns until my eyes burned. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. What had started as a mission to prove them wrong was slowly transforming into something I hadn't dared hope for. A real life not defined by my past, nor by the need to see my family kneel before me. Yet even as Phoenix Digital grew, there were moments when the old shadows crept back. Sometimes it happened in the quiet just before dawn, when the city outside my window still slept, and I'd catch my reflection in the glass. Older now, more worn around the edges, but still carrying the memory of a boy in handcuffs. And the question would echo in my mind. If I'm not living just to make them regret, then what am I living for? One evening, after everyone had left, I stayed behind, surrounded by the hum of the office servers and the glow of screensaver lights bouncing on the walls. The silence pressed on me until I couldn't stand it anymore, and I opened the drawer where I kept a single photograph. Me at 17, standing awkwardly at a family barbecue, my father's hand on my shoulder, my mother smiling beside me, and Matthew in the background, grinning with the careless ease of someone who'd never had to question his place. Looking at that photo, I felt a strange ache. Not nostalgia, but mourning for a life that could have been, a version of us that never quite existed. The boy in that picture had wanted nothing more than to belong, to be seen. And for so many years, I'd convinced myself that success alone would fill that emptiness. But sitting there, with the hum of the city outside and the weight of the years behind me, I realized that success built on spite was a hollow kind of victory. I had won, but the moment I stopped living for revenge, the real victory revealed itself. Freedom. Freedom to be more than their rejection. Freedom to build something that mattered not just to me but to people like Rosa, Eric, and Jasmine, those who had given me a chance when no one else would. In the months that followed, I began to shift how I led my company. I still demanded excellence, but I stopped measuring my worth by whether my family feared or obeyed me. I started listening more, not just to clients but to my own employees, many of whom had stories not so different from mine. Stories of being underestimated, of stumbling and falling, of finding strength in places they'd never expected. And slowly my family's roles began to change too. Matthew proved surprisingly good at building client relationships, once the weight of rivalry between us lifted. My father, with decades of quiet observation, helped us avoid mistakes in expansion. Even my mother, once so obsessed with appearances, began to show real pride, not in a son who had made the family look good, but in the man I had become, shaped by scars rather than defeated by them. Yet forgiveness is never as neat as stories make it sound. There were still days when anger flared unexpectedly. A careless comment, an old memory stirred by a smell or a street corner. But each time the fire burned shorter, leaving behind not ashes of resentment, but lessons etched deep into who I was. One night, years after Matthew first knocked on my office door, we ended up at a small bar after work. We shared a quiet drink, words slow to come, until finally Matthew looked at me, eyes clearer than I'd seen in years, and said, "I know I can't change what happened, but I'm glad we got here somehow." For a moment I didn't know what to say. Then I realized words weren't enough. Instead I nodded, raised my glass and clinked it against his. It wasn't an erasure of the past, but it was an acknowledgement of the present. And sometimes that's the best you can give. Driving home that night, the city lights flickering past, I thought of that boy in the mugshot, the one who thought his story ended the day the cell door closed. And I whispered to him, not with pride or anger but with quiet certainty, "You were wrong. It was only the beginning." Years passed, though I barely noticed at first. Phoenix Digital grew beyond anything I'd dared to imagine back when I was pitching ideas in cramped diners and fighting exhaustion at 2 in the morning. The office expanded to 2 floors, then 3. The team grew from a handful to dozens, each with stories that reminded me of my own. Stories of falling and getting back up, often not because someone pulled them to their feet but because they refused to stay down. Yet growth brought new challenges too. Meetings became longer, stakes higher. There were contracts worth more than I'd once dreamed of making in a lifetime, and clients whose faith had to be earned every single day. Sometimes, in the middle of another 12-hour stretch, I'd look around the glass-walled conference room and wonder if I had traded one kind of prison for another. But then I'd catch sight of something simple. Rose's Cafe logo in our portfolio, the same project that started it all. And I'd remember why I kept going. Not for revenge, but because for the first time what I did felt like it meant something. One quiet Saturday, long after the staff had gone home, I walked through the empty office. Sunlight pooled on the polished floors, catching dust in slow spirals. I paused by the wall where we kept photos of our earliest clients, faces that trusted me when they had no reason to. I traced a finger lightly over Rose's picture, then Eric's bookstore, Jasmine's restaurant. In that silence, I realized something that felt both obvious and profound. I hadn't just built a company. I'd built a kind of redemption, not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but something steadier. It didn't erase the past, but it gave the past meaning. Around that same time, something unexpected happened. I started mentoring young people fresh out of prison or with records that closed more doors than they could count. It began almost by accident. A former inmate wrote to me asking how I'd done it, how I'd convinced people to take a chance. His words felt like reading my own fears from years ago. So I replied. At first it was a single message. Then another. Then it grew into weekly calls, a network of sorts, where men and women who thought their lives had ended learned to see possibility again. In their voices, I heard echoes of who I'd been. Afraid, angry, ashamed. And in helping them, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in years. Purpose beyond myself. One of them, a young woman named Kayla, reminded me so much of who I'd been. It hurt. She'd been caught in a fraud scheme she hadn't fully understood, served 18 months and walked out to silence from her family. They won't even speak my name, she told me once, voice shaking. I remembered that sting too well. You can't force them, I told her gently. But you can build something they can't ignore. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize their forgiveness matters less than you think. Her journey wasn't quick or easy. But months later, when she sent me a photo of the small online business she'd started, her smile was real. Not the brittle smile of someone pretending, but the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered they could stand again. Watching her, and others like her, reminded me why I'd fought so hard. Not just to silence the laughter of my past, but to become someone who could offer a hand to those still in the dark. Back at the office, my family's roles had found a strange kind of balance. Matthew had grown into his job, not as my brother trying to impress me, but as a man building something of his own. My father, once so distant, would sometimes stop by my office just to share a quiet coffee, saying little, but his presence speaking more than words. My mother, proud and still careful with her praise, surprised me one day by telling a new hire, "Daniel built this from nothing. Don't forget that." Hearing her say it out loud felt surreal, almost like a memory I'd invented. But it was real. And it meant something, not everything, but enough. At home I kept that same photograph from my teenage years, but now it hung on the wall, not hidden in a drawer. It reminded me daily, the boy in the photo hadn't been weak for wanting to belong. He'd just been unprepared for what the world could take from you. But from that loss had come something else. Something he couldn't have imagined. Some nights I'd stand in my apartment window, city lights blinking in quiet Morse code. And I'd whisper to that boy, "They laughed once. But now you've built something they can never take away. And it matters far beyond them." In that whisper there wasn't spite anymore. Just peace. And in that peace, for the first time in my life, I truly felt free. Years of struggle, pain, and hard work had finally begun to shape the man I was meant to be. But no journey worth telling is without its fire. The moments that test everything you've built, that force you to decide who you really are beneath all the masks and walls. For me, that fire came unexpectedly, in the form of a crisis that could have destroyed everything. It started with a call late one evening. The voice on the other end was panicked. One of our biggest clients had just dropped us. Reasons were vague. Budget cuts, they said. But the truth was clearer to me. They didn't want to be associated with someone with my past. The subtle prejudices I'd fought so hard to outrun had found me again, disguised in corporate politeness. It stung. It burned. I sat in my office long after the call ended, the city lights blinking mockingly through the window. For a moment I felt like that scared boy again, frozen behind bars, wondering if this was the end. But then something inside me flared. The fire I'd kept alive all those years, fueled by pain and determination, ignited once more. "This isn't over," I whispered to myself. "Not by a long shot." The next weeks were brutal. I worked harder than ever, reaching out to new clients, revising strategies, convincing others that Phoenix Digital was more than a company. It was a promise. A promise that no mistake, no past failure could define what we could achieve. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about proving to myself that the fire within me was stronger than any setback. In the middle of that storm, my family's support became unexpectedly real. Matthew came by every morning before work, carrying coffee and offering ideas. My father, once distant, helped smooth over tough negotiations, his experience suddenly invaluable. Even my mother, quiet but steady, sent encouraging texts. Their presence wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the present and the future we could build together. Yet the fire within was about more than business. It was about the scars I carried, the nights alone, the shame, the loneliness that had once consumed me. I began to speak openly about my journey, sharing my story with employees, clients, and young people I mentored. Vulnerability became strength. Admitting the darkest parts of my past didn't make me weak. It made me human. One day, during a company meeting, I told the team, "Our failures don't define us. It's how we rise from them that matters." Their faces lit up with something I hadn't seen in a long time: belief. Not just in me but in themselves. The fire that threatened to consume everything had transformed into a beacon. A light that guided not only my path but the paths of those around me. It reminded me that the hardest battles often forge the strongest warriors. Looking back, I realized the arrest, the humiliation, the family's rejection, they were chapters, not the whole story. The fire within me was never just about revenge. It was about transformation. About taking the pain and turning it into power, not to tear others down but to build myself, and others, up. Tonight, as I sit in my office watching the city breathe below, I feel that fire still burning. Not as rage or anger but as passion, resilience, and hope. And that is the real victory. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds as I sat at my desk, a cup of coffee growing cold beside my laptop. It was quiet, too quiet for someone who once thrived on chaos and struggle. But in that stillness I found clarity. After everything, the arrests, the betrayals, the nights spent doubting myself, I realized the future wasn't something that just happened to me. It was something I chose. The past had shaped me, no doubt about that. But it didn't have to define me. I was no longer the scared boy who'd been humiliated, no longer the man driven solely by revenge. Instead, I was someone who understood that true strength comes from acceptance. Accepting the past, forgiving those who hurt you, and most importantly, forgiving yourself. I looked around the office, the space I'd built piece by piece. It wasn't just a company, it was a testament to resilience. Every success, every client, every late night was a brick in the foundation of a new life. A life I was proud to own. Still, the journey wasn't over. With growth came responsibility, not just to my business or my family but to myself. I knew there were moments ahead that would test me again. But this time I wouldn't face them with anger or bitterness. I'd face them with a quiet confidence forged in fire. That afternoon I met with Kayla, one of the young entrepreneurs I mentored. She sat across from me, her eyes bright with dreams and determination. Watching her reminded me of my own beginnings, of the hope that had seemed so fragile, yet had carried me through the darkest times. "I'm scared," she admitted, "that I'll fail again." I smiled gently. Fear is part of the journey. But it doesn't have to stop you. Remember, your past is a story, not a sentence. You get to decide what comes next. She nodded, and in that moment I saw not just a mentee but a reflection of my own journey. A reminder that no matter where we start, what matters is how we rise. Driving home that evening, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, I thought of all the moments that led me here. The arrests, the silence of my family, the endless nights of work and doubt. And I felt something new. Peace. They might have laughed when I was down. They might have turned away. But I had risen. Not just to prove them wrong but to prove to myself that I was more than my mistakes. That I was the author of my own story. And the story was far from over. The path I'd walked was anything but straight. Looking back, I saw how every twist and fall had carved the man I'd become. sometimes jagged, sometimes smooth, but always real. That man sat behind the desk in my office now, a place far removed from the cold concrete cells and harsh fluorescent lights of my past. Yet the memories lingered, like shadows that danced just beyond the reach of light. It was in the quiet moments, when the bustle of the day faded, that those shadows grew the loudest. The past was never far away, reminding me of mistakes, of faces turned away, of laughter that once cut deep. But instead of shrinking from those shadows, I'd learned to walk with them, to use their weight to push myself forward rather than pull me down. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I found myself alone in the office, the city lights twinkling below like distant promises. I pulled out an old journal, its pages yellowed and worn, filled with scribbles of dreams and plans from a time when hope was fragile but fierce. Flipping through it, I felt a surge of gratitude, grateful for the pain that had shaped me, for the rejection that had hardened me, and for the fire that refused to die. It was that fire that pushed me to take risks. To grow Phoenix Digital beyond what anyone expected. To build a team not just of employees but of fighters. People who believed in second chances, who understood that greatness often blooms from brokenness. Among them was Kayla, whose journey mirrored my own in so many ways. Watching her rise from the ashes of her past reminded me of my own strength, and the responsibility I carried to help others find theirs. Together we worked late into nights, planning new campaigns, brainstorming ideas, and sharing stories of struggle and triumph. But success brought new challenges. Not all clients were kind. Not all opportunities were honest. The world beyond those prison walls was complex, filled with shadows of its own. Sometimes old habits of mistrust crept back, and I had to remind myself daily that forgiveness, especially of myself, was the cornerstone of true freedom. In my family, the tides continued to shift. Matthew, once the brother who had mocked me in my darkest hour, became a partner I could trust. My father's quiet pride warmed the spaces where silence had lived too long. Even my mother's hesitant words of praise felt like sunlight breaking through years of clouds. Yet I knew the journey was ongoing. Forgiveness wasn't a destination but a path, sometimes smooth, sometimes rocky, but always forward. And in that truth lay hope. One night as I walked home beneath the stars, I thought of the boy who had been taken away in handcuffs, the boy who felt lost and alone. I whispered into the night, "You are not forgotten. You are the seed from which everything grew." The fire within me was no longer fueled by pain or revenge, but by purpose. A purpose bigger than any one person, bigger than any past mistake. It was the purpose of building, healing, and lifting others as I climbed. The road ahead was uncertain, as it always is. But I faced it with a heart unchained, a spirit unbroken, and a soul set free. And that was the greatest victory of all. The years had taught me many things, but perhaps the most profound lesson was that true legacy is not built on wealth or titles, but on the lives we touch and the bridges we build. I often found myself reflecting on how far I'd come, not just in business but as a person learning to forgive, to lead, and to hope. Phoenix Digital was no longer just my company. It had become a community. Every member of the team carried a story, a struggle, a past they were determined to overcome. Together we forged something greater than the sum of our parts. A place where failures weren't the end, but the beginning of transformation. One afternoon I sat with Kayla, now a confident entrepreneur whose business was thriving beyond what she once dreamed. We talked about beginnings, about the roads that had led us here. Her eyes sparkled with gratitude and determination, reminding me of the fragile hope I'd once clung to in my darkest days. "It's not just about success," she said. "It's about showing others that their past doesn't have to be their future." I nodded. Exactly. And it starts with believing in yourself even when no one else does. My family, too, had changed in ways I'd never expected. Matthew, once the symbol of my rejection, became one of my closest allies. Our relationship was still complex. Wounds don't vanish overnight, but we learned to build something new from the broken pieces. My father, with his quiet wisdom, offered guidance that only years of experience could bring. And my mother, softened by time, showed a pride in me that was once buried beneath judgment. But legacy isn't only about family or business. It's about what we leave behind in the hearts of others. That belief led me to expand our mentoring program, reaching out to young people fresh out of prison or stuck in cycles of despair. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, that someone had walked their path and emerged stronger. The need to carry the past like a burden. Every client gained, Every project completed, every person I mentored was a step toward freedom. My family's journey was part of that liberation too. Matthew, once my harshest critic, became a partner. My father, who rarely showed emotion, finally let me see his pride. Even my mother, with all her complexity, opened a small door to healing. Yet the true freedom was internal. It was waking up each day without the heavy fog of anger. It was finding peace in the silence that once felt like rejection. It was standing tall not because others bowed before me, but because I stood strong in my own truth. There were days when old wounds ached, when the past whispered cruel lies. But I no longer let them define me. Instead, I chose growth, resilience, and hope. And that choice, made every day, is the real victory. Looking ahead, I don't pretend the road is easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But I face them now with a heart unshackled and a spirit unbroken. Because breaking the chains isn't just about freedom from the past. It's about the power to shape your own future. And that future is mine to create. The shadows of my past have never fully disappeared. They lurk at the edges of my thoughts, sometimes whispering doubts, sometimes reminding me of the pain I've endured. But I've learned to see those shadows differently, not as enemies but as parts of my story that shaped my strength. When I was younger, every shadow felt like a threat, a reminder of failure and rejection. The arrest, the humiliation by my family, the nights spent alone with nothing but my regrets, they all cast long shadows over my soul. For a long time I believed those shadows defined me. But strength doesn't come from ignoring darkness. It comes from embracing it. From walking through it and discovering what lies beyond. There were moments when the weight of the past almost crushed me. Times when I wondered if I'd ever be free from the pain that had become a constant companion. But each time I chose to rise. To face the shadows head-on and let them teach me. Building Phoenix Digital was part of that journey. It wasn't just a company, it was a battleground where I fought my demons every day. Every success was a victory over the doubt. Every failure a lesson in resilience. My family's journey mirrored my own struggles. Matthew's skepticism slowly gave way to respect. My father's silence softened into pride. Even my mother, with all her complexities, began to heal the fractures between us. Yet it wasn't their approval I sought. It was my own. In quiet moments, I would remind myself that my worth wasn't tied to their acceptance or the mistakes I'd made. It was rooted in the man I was becoming, the man who refused to be defined by his past. One night, after a particularly hard day, I sat alone in the office. The city lights flickered below and I felt the familiar pull of the shadows. But instead of shrinking from them, I welcomed their presence. They were reminders of my journey, my growth. I whispered to myself, "You are stronger than your shadows." And in that whispered affirmation I found peace. The shadows will always be there, but they no longer control me. They remind me of where I've been but never where I'm going. Because strength isn't the absence of darkness, it's the courage to walk through it. And that courage? It's mine. There's a fire inside me, one that was sparked long ago in the darkest moments of my life when everything seemed lost. That fire burned through shame, through rejection, through every obstacle that tried to keep me down. It's the fire that kept me going when no one believed I could rise. I remember the night I was arrested, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the harsh glare of the police lights. My family's laughter ringing in my ears like a cruel soundtrack to my fall. I felt broken, humiliated, defeated. But deep inside, a small ember refused to die. That ember grew into a flame. Building Phoenix Digital was like feeding that fire. Each challenge, each setback, each victory fanned it stronger. The company wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of my refusal to be defined by my past. But fire is not just about destruction. It's about transformation. It melts the old and shapes the new. It burns away what no longer serves us, leaving behind the purest version of ourselves. There were days when the flames threatened to consume me, when doubts crept in, when fear whispered I wasn't enough. But every time I chose to face the fire head-on, to stand within it and let it forge me stronger. My family's reactions evolved too. The same people who once mocked me began to see the man the fire had shaped. Matthew, once a rival, became a trusted partner. My father's quiet pride replaced years of silence. Even my mother's guarded respect was a kind of victory. But the most important fire was the one within me. The passion to keep growing, to keep fighting, to keep rising. That fire is why I mentor others who feel lost, who struggle with their own shadows. I want them to know that no matter how dark it gets, the fire inside can light the way. Tonight, as I sit here watching the city glow, I feel that fire burning bright, not as anger or vengeance but as strength, resilience, and hope. It's the fire that forged me, and it will never go out. Life has a way of throwing storms at you when you least expect it. After all the battles I'd fought, the victories I'd earned, and the peace I'd started to find, the storm came, fierce and unrelenting. It began with an unexpected betrayal. Someone I'd trusted, a key member of my team, quietly working against the company's best interests. The shock cut deep, deeper than any family rejection or past humiliation. It shook the foundation of everything I'd built. For days I wrestled with anger and disbelief. I wanted to lash out, to burn bridges and sever ties. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "This storm is part of your journey. How you weather it will define you." So I faced it, not with rage but with resolve. I gathered my team, shared the truth, and focused on rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy. There were wounds that wouldn't heal overnight, doubts that lingered in the air. But together we weathered the storm. In that turmoil I learned the power of forgiveness, not just of others but of myself. Forgiving the past, forgiving mistakes, and choosing to move forward without the weight of resentment. My family too rallied in unexpected ways. Matthew stood by me not as a competitor but as a brother. My father's steady presence became a source of strength. And even my mother, once distant, offered quiet support. The storm tested us all. But in its wake came clarity and calm. Standing on the balcony one night, watching the city breathe beneath a sky cleansed by rain, I realized that storms don't last forever. They clear the air, reveal new paths, and remind us of our own resilience. The past had thrown its worst at me, but I had survived. And I would keep rising, through every storm, into every calm. Because the story isn't about the storm itself. It's about what comes after. From the outside it seemed like I had it all figured out. A successful company, a family that had come back around, and a future full of promise. But inside I carried a heavy weight, the weight of expectations. Everyone expected me to be perfect now. The son who had risen from disgrace, the brother who healed wounds, the entrepreneur who never stumbled. But what they didn't see were the cracks beneath the surface. The nights filled with doubt, the moments when fear whispered that I wasn't enough, that I would fail again. The truth is, success doesn't erase pain. It doesn't silence fear. It only changes the form of the battles we face. I found myself overwhelmed by the pressure to live up to not just my own hopes but those of everyone watching. I began to question, how long could I keep this up? Was I becoming the person I wanted to be, or just a version the world expected? One afternoon, worn down by it all, I reached out to Kayla. I told her how exhausted I felt, how I feared the whole world was waiting for me to fall. She looked me in the eye and said something that stuck with me. "You keep going because you've already survived the worst. This is just another challenge. And you're stronger than you think." Her words grounded me. They reminded me that the weight I carried wasn't mine to bear alone. I realized I'd been carrying expectations that weren't all mine, and it was time to let some of that go. I gave myself permission to be imperfect, to stumble, and to still keep rising. Because the real strength isn't in being flawless. It's in continuing even when we're broken. That day, I made a promise to myself. To live authentically, to embrace my flaws, and to focus on progress over perfection. The weight of expectations would always be there, but it would no longer define who I am. For a long time, I believed I had to face the world alone. That asking for help was a sign of weakness. But through Phoenix Digital, I discovered something far more powerful. The strength that comes from connection. I didn't just build a company, I built a community. A family of people with stories like mine, people who had fallen and fought their way back. The power of connection changed everything. My colleagues became friends, our shared struggles creating bonds that money could never buy. Mentoring young people like Kayla gave me purpose beyond profits. It gave me a reason to believe in second chances. Together, we created spaces where stories like ours could be heard. Stories of struggle, hope, and transformation. I learned to be vulnerable, to ask for help, and to offer support without hesitation. I realized strength isn't about standing alone. It's about standing together. One evening, during a company celebration surrounded by laughter and warmth, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. I looked around and saw not just employees but a family. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, From the boy who was humiliated and isolated to the man who stood surrounded by people who believed in him. Connection became the foundation of everything I had built. A foundation strong enough to withstand any storm. Looking back, I see now that every moment, the pain, the triumphs, the tears, the laughter, led me here. The boy who was arrested, humiliated, and abandoned is not gone. He's the foundation beneath the man I've become. But this isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning. Every day is a new page, a chance to rewrite what's possible. To choose hope over fear. To choose love over resentment. To choose freedom over chains. Today I stand surrounded by a family rebuilt, a thriving company, and a life forged in fire. And I know this deeply. Our past shapes us, but it does not define us. The real victory is in rising, not just once but again and again. Looking to the future, I'm ready. Ready to face whatever comes with a heart open, a spirit unbroken, and a fire that will never go out. This is my story. The story of a boy who became a man. The story of a family who found its way back. The story of a life lived beyond limits. And it's only just begun. Some mornings before the city fully wakes, I find myself staring at the skyline through the glass of my office window. The dawn paints the buildings in soft gold, and for a few moments, everything feels suspended between what was and what might be. It's in these quiet hours that I allow myself to dream beyond what I've already built, to imagine the next chapter, even if it terrifies me. For so long my life was about proving them wrong. My family, my critics, and maybe most of all myself. Rising from those dark days wasn't just about redemption. It was about survival. But lately I've realized that merely surviving isn't enough anymore. The fire that once fueled me with anger and stubbornness has shifted into something deeper. A hunger not just to exist but to create something lasting. Phoenix Digital stands stronger than I ever imagined. The halls echo not with silence, but with ideas, laughter, and the clack of keyboards typing visions into reality. Watching my team, people who once doubted themselves now confident and driven, reminds me of how far we've come together. Kayla, especially, has become not only a partner in business but a friend who sees past the title and into the person I really am. And yet, success has opened doors to new fears. The fear of complacency. The fear of losing what I've built. The fear that maybe after everything I don't know who I am without a fight to win. Some days I catch my reflection in the dark glass of the window, and I'm not sure if I see the man who once dreamed of freedom or the man terrified of losing it. It's in these moments I remember the boy who sat in a cold cell, handcuffed and alone, shamed by the very people whose love he craved most. That boy never thought he'd see the inside of an office tower, never mind own one. Remembering him keeps me humble and hungry. My family too has changed in ways I'm still learning to trust. Matthew's laughter feels genuine now, less edged with rivalry. My father, older now, sometimes sits across from me in silence that feels comfortable, as if words are no longer needed. And my mother, though still guarded, calls me by my name, not just son, as if acknowledging I've earned my place in her eyes. Yet healing isn't a straight road. Old wounds ache at unexpected times. Anniversaries, places, or a stray comment can drag the past back into sharp focus. But where once I'd bury the pain, now I face it, not to dwell but to understand. The past shaped me, but it doesn't have to imprison me. Lately I've been thinking about what comes next. Not just for the company but for me. I want to do more than build wealth or prestige. I want to build something that outlives my name. To help people who, like I once did, believe they have nothing left. Maybe that's why mentoring matters so much to me. Each time I see someone find hope where there was none, it heals something in me too. Looking out at the horizon, I know the story isn't over. There are still fears to face, dreams to chase, and scars to learn from. But for the first time, my vision of the future isn't just about running from the past. It's about running towards something greater. And whatever waits beyond that horizon, I'm ready to meet it.